suddenly there was this profusion of guns and the creation of a sort of local market for the sale of guns. And guns moved very rapidly through the gangs on the Cape Flats, with the resulting uptick in deaths. And very soon, gunshot wounds become the most common way in which people were dying on the Cape Flats.
Hello and welcome. I'm Misha Glenny, and today we're going to be talking about this book, Give Us More Guns, How South Africa's Gangs Were Armed. Now, this centres on one of the deadliest crimes in post-apartheid South Africa, the illegal sale of guns to South Africa's crime bosses. But what's really shocking about this story is the man responsible for it was a senior police officer. The result was a bloodbath that stretched out over years and continues to this day. And we know that at least 1,000 deaths have been directly attributed to the sale of those guns. In his book, Mark Shaw describes how this grim drama unfolded, the impact it had on South Africa's underworld, and how corruption in South Africa's police reflected a wider malaise of the state, particularly during the presidency of Jacob Zuma. And I'm very pleased to say that Mark Shaw is with us here today. Mark, welcome.
Thank you, Misha. Thank you very much.
Look, Mark, I've got a bone to pick with you to begin with, because you're an academic researcher, in terms of your background, and you run a very serious think tank, the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. But I've got to tell you, with books like these, you're going to start putting journalists out of a job, because apart from the many insights there are here about organised crime, about South Africa, about urban violence, this is a real page turner. And so to start with, before we talk about some of the broader issues behind it, what I want you to do is tell me about the senior police officer I referred to earlier, Colonel Christiaan Prinsloo, and tell us what he did and why he did it.
Thank you very much, Misha. That's very, very kind of you. The story essentially revolves around, in a sense, the recommissioning of guns back from the South African Police Service into the central storage facility, plus the handing in of guns during a set of amnesties in South Africa. And as you can imagine, South Africa, gun control was one of the primary focuses of the new government. And so there was a series of appeals for people to hand in their guns. And those the decommissioned guns plus the guns from the amnesty were stored away waiting to be destroyed. And Colonel Prinsloo was a senior officer responsible, one of the gun gurus of the South African Police Service, responsible for the destruction of those guns. Now, some guns were destroyed, but over a period of time, he and others, as the book outlines, saw a profit motive to sell those guns on. And he essentially looked around for a market in the underworld where he could sell illicit weapons. And he did that to the South African gangs, mainly concentrated in the Western Cape, although, as you know, they were evolving as South Africa integrated into the process of globalization, post-apartheid, and globalization itself continued. And he sold over many years vast quantities of guns. And as you know, in the book, he has admitted to 2,400, but the likely number is much, much higher than that.
Let me get this straight, Mark. So what you're saying is you've got all of these guns which are decommissioned from the South African police force. You've got guns which have been handed in when the amnesties were announced. And this guy, this senior police officer, who was a great firearms expert, as I understand it.
Correct.
He was then taking those guns literally out of the back door, as it were,
Right.
and then selling it to organized crime bosses. How did that sale happen?
He was quite clever in at least my view. He didn't want to get too close to people in the underworld. I think he recognized that this would be a dirty game of haggling around price. So he picked an intermediary. It's unclear whether or how they decided to sell to the gangs. His initial story was that he, in fact, intended to sell to people doing anti-piracy patrols of Somalia, and that they would then dump the guns overboard, so there would be no trace of those. I think that's largely a nonsense, frankly. He picked an intermediary who's still to stand trial for this. The case continues to move very slowly through the courts for a variety of reasons. And the alleged intermediary made contact with the gangs, and gangs that had money or cash available came forward and bought the guns. And what's really interesting is, of course, it empowered some gangs over others. And the title of the book comes from the fact that gangs went back to the intermediary to demand guns. In a sense, they wanted to sell, but they themselves then lost control over the process. And there was this real demand for firearms in and around the Western Cape from about 2007 to around 2012, 2013.
So just so people understand the situation in the Western Cape, you have what's called the Cape Flats, which are essentially the townships around the centre of Cape Town. If you drive in from the airport, you can see them to your left, to your right, where people live in very difficult conditions and where gangs essentially rule based upon the drugs trade in Cape Town. So what was the impact of suddenly injecting large amounts of weaponry into these feuding gangs in the various parts of the Cape Flats?
Misha, it's worth to answer that question stepping back a little to say that the South African underworld began to be transformed in about the late 1980s, early 1990s, as you know very well. In sort of the post-authoritarian, in the period around the transition, there was a greater inflow of drugs, a variety of different types, and an expansion of drug markets. And that expanded again at the turn of the millennium. And the gangs, like gangs everywhere, have this sort of triangle of territorial control to sell drugs, the desire to recruit people into their gangs, and guns are an essential part of expanding that territorial control. So if you can access guns, you can expand the area in which you can make money. So the sort of local economy of the underworld was put on steroids, if you like, by this infusion of guns. It wasn't like there were not guns before, but there were simply not guns at the same volume. And gang members told me repeatedly that before, if you had a gun loaned by the gang boss, you had to return it, and if you didn't return it, you were liable to be hurt or killed. Suddenly there was this profusion of guns and the creation of a sort of local market for the sale of guns. And guns moved very rapidly through the gangs on the Cape Flats, with the resulting uptick in deaths. And very soon, gunshot wounds become the most common way in which people were dying on the Cape Flats. So it's a kind of perfect storm in a way, and the guns were a crucial part of that.
Right, and the figures here when it comes to homicides and, as you say, gunshot wounds, they're really eye-popping. I mean, it's just so dramatic what happens in Cape Town over the past 10 years. I want to shift over to the east of South Africa to ask you about the other area, KwaZulu-Natal, and in particular Durban, where some of the guns also reached, again, selling to crime bosses. But this is slightly different because the industry there was not the drugs industry so much, but the taxi industry, which is one of the most lucrative markets in South Africa. And it sounds to me, the way you describe it, that essentially you had protection rackets which were legalized by the South African state and then able to start buying some of these weapons. It's almost as though in Italy, the Cosa Nostra was suddenly legalized to be able to compete with the Carabinieri, for example. I mean, what was going on in KwaZulu-Natal at this point?
KwaZulu-Natal has a long history of violence and a long history of access to weaponry. So arms caches, the South African state had indeed supplied weapons during the conflict there in the 1980s. And the taxi industry is a very interesting beast in the context of South Africa because it's a entrepreneurial marvel. All these people who made good money providing an important service because the state couldn't provide transport. But it almost grew too fast, and the state proved unable to regulate it. And it's almost like a classic mafia style tale that the industry then begins to regulate itself. And because in the industry, several important so-called taxi bosses rise up, and the way they get market share, similar to the gangs, it's very territorial, is on routes. And routes, to protect routes, you use violence and threat. To advance up different taxi associations, you use violence or threat. And so this picture emerges of an important entrepreneurial industry which has in it an imprint of violence, sort of violence in its DNA. And out of that, and it's an issue I had looked at previously, emerges a kind of political economy of hits. So the payment to kill individuals in opposing taxi associations, but also within taxi associations, so you as an individual can rise up. And there's a pattern of extortion and payment and access to ranks. There's a whole economy around the industry, and that industry needs guns. And the book recounts both how illegal guns flowed there, and there's some evidence that, in fact, Prinsloo went to KwaZulu-Natal first because one of his compatriots came from that particular province. But at the same time, it shows how taxi bosses reached into the legal licensing system to acquire legal guns. And there were several very prominent shootouts in Durban and elsewhere where legal guns and the sort of arming up of private security companies to form protection for the taxi industry has become a phenomena. So it's a different phenomena to the Western Cape. But again, it's this the broader failure around state gun control, I think, which has provided a spur for violence and the violence associated, in which ordinary people, commuters, are drawn in, given the need to move around public transport, etc.
I want to come on to that issue of gun control and actually some of the measures that you propose are needed to prevent this sort of thing from happening in the future. So you come out with some prescriptions in the book. Be helpful if you could just outline a couple of those, but also behind that, to what extent can you separate reform of law enforcement structures from the broader issues of state capture, which of course has become a very popular phrase under Zuma? Are you looking at just the law enforcement sector, or are you having to see a wider, broader reform without which law enforcement cannot hope to progress?
It's a really good question, Misha. What the book recounts is the investigation of this case, as you know. And when you look at the investigation, and in fact, the very courageous police officers who were involved, who came from the Cape Flats, etc., what is so clear is that the system didn't work. It's essentially a network of officers who went around the system, and indeed whose investigation then ended at one point, who went around the system in order to pursue this particular case. And they didn't trust anybody within the system. And that was partly a feature of the division of the South African police service itself into two factions. And in the Western Cape, so-called, a very South African emphasized word, so-called factionalism within the police service basically means that the service is at a stalemate. It can't work. And a lot of that dispute takes place on the shadier gray side of policing in so-called crime intelligence, the the inheritance of the security branch and the infusion of people from ANC intelligence, etc. And that system is more about internal competition and sort of trying to obtain information on each other and this real internal fight, and much less about crime fighting. And the real sense that crime intelligence as an institution is and became badly compromised in the Zuma years. And that provincial development was matched by a set of developments at national level where crime intelligence became a tool, both through the interception of calls, but also arguably through the payment of monies around the factional politics of the ANC. So the sense that policing becomes badly broken and that the guns case is part of that. So that's one element. An associated element is, of course, the police are eager to point out, well, Prinsloo was arrested and he was a so-called bad apple. And the point I want to make in the book is that might be true, but in fact, the systems within the police were broken, that somebody could steal these volume of weaponry and transfer them to the underworld. So literally the law enforcement body pushing guns into the underworld and not doing that over several months or on a once-off basis, but over several years and thousands of guns, simply points to a system that is broken. And as you know in the book, I think the issue for me and speaking to a lot of people on the Cape Flats and mothers of children that have been killed and wounded, etc., and that process continues to occur, is that there's been no acknowledgement by the police or the state of this phenomena. In fact, the police have largely been quiet about the phenomena, apart from the very vocal lead investigating officer. There's really no acknowledgement that the police have broken the trust of the public, that the police themselves are part of the problem in this particular case. And that leads on to the suggestions I might make by way of conclusion. And part of that is to say, well, do we need an independent mechanism to look and to secure guns that are destroyed? This great break of public trust that people can hand in guns in an amnesty. And Prinsloo himself is on record as calling for those guns, as you saw in the book, and etc., while he himself was selling them on. So this great break of public trust, and whether there isn't a way where there can be an external mechanism to determine that guns have been destroyed. That's the first point. The second point, which is very important to me, having worked in the state in the early years of the new democracy myself, is to return to some of the principles of gun control. And the reality was, and this makes the story almost more depressing, but also in some ways hopeful, is that South Africa was beginning to succeed in bringing down violence by 2004, 2005. And I quote an important article in the South African Medical Journal, which says, where have all the guns gone? That was in that early 2000s period. And murders were beginning to decline. They weren't declining rapidly, but they were certainly on this long, slow decline. And then this ratcheting up of the numbers, which must be due in large parts to the introduction of guns into the system again. So to return to the fundamental principles around gun control, to understand that the illegal gun market is key to driving the homicide rate and the nature of organized crime in the context of South Africa. And that needs to be a core policy focus, I would argue.
Before we move on to more international issues, just briefly, have things improved since Cyril Ramaphosa became president, or is his factionalism within the ANC still such a problem that reform is slow in coming?
Again, it's a really good question. I want to argue that there is an improvement, but there are still enormous challenges within the police. So if you're reading the news recently, there's a dispute between the National Commissioner and the Minister. There remains ongoing disputes. One of the officers, Peter Jacobs, became head of crime intelligence. He's subsequently been moved aside for the moment. So there's a whole lot of jockeying for position around, a lot of it to do with corruption, so that the process of factionalism continues. And the system and the systems generally, the computer systems, etc., remain, in my view, either not working or compromised, etc. So is the problem fixed? By no stretch of the imagination. There's an enormous amount of work to do. And one of the issues that I feel is worth highlighting is that in some ways the police have taken a step back, more authoritarian, more reactive. It's sort of the same cycle you see, Misha, which you yourself know well, in Latin America. Violence between the police and gangs, no strategy apart from a sort of a dramatic hit back, no forward thinking, the failure to promote imaginative thinking officers, etc., etc. All of that still characterizes the system. There is some hope in that there are a number of cases being prosecuted, including the people around Prinsloo. That process goes on. But in addition, two hugely important cases around prominent members of the underworld, so crime bosses, who acquired or are alleged to acquire guns illegally through the Central Firearms Registry. And what's interesting there is that those individuals who are implicated in a wider category of illicit markets in the Western Cape, amongst others, may well be prosecuted, a little bit like Al Capone, for tax offenses around gun licensing offenses. So this issue of guns and the stream of the narrative around Prinsloo is also linked to a broader narrative around the illegal licensing of guns and corruption, and the killing of a very brave police officer, a guy called Charles Kinnear, who was killed in a targeted hit, who was investigating one of those cases. Now, those two cases will go forward, I hope, in the coming months. There's a lot of pressures that are brought to bear on the system. Corruption, threat, both to prosecutors and investigators. If the system can hold steady, there should be very significant prosecutions at the end of that. But I think we need to wait and see. And then there needs to be a strategic response, because removing those individuals on their own is not enough to undercut the underworld. It allows space for other players who are in the system to move upwards. So it's prosecutions on their own and a more strategic focus, I would argue, which is needed in future.
Okay, Mark, let's broaden it out a little bit to see what the implications are for the rest of the world. I mean, you just mentioned Latin America. Of course, in the early 1990s, we saw an infusion of guns into the favelas of Rio and Sao Paulo, for example. So this is not an entirely new phenomenon, although it's a very striking one in South Africa. What does this case tell us for the broader issues of governance, of gun control, drugs law reform, the whole gamut? Because it does have implications for the rest of the world, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And I think what it says, Misha, is there's a cocktail of issues that are, none of them are per se new, but there's a cocktail of issues in several big, prominent urban centers around the world, where the Global Initiative, as you know, is doing a range of work, whether that's in Mexico or Brazil or elsewhere, where the millennial or the sort of post-millennial drugs market, the supply of cheap drugs, the growth of youth gangs, the degree of marginalization and inequality in these urban spaces, very similar to Cape Town, and the infusion of guns in a variety of ways, sometimes from the state, and the state is always a useful source of guns because you can get them in bulk, but in a multitude of ways, has really upped over a sustained period of time homicide rates. And when you look at that, again, as you know well, those rates equal, if are not worse, than many conflict areas around the world. But because they occur in very marginalized spaces, they are often ignored. what you get is a kind of criminal control. And in Latin America, and in a sense, you've had some of that in South Africa, but that may in fact portend the future. You get a counter response, sort of growth of militias working with the police, and the cycle of violence which develops. And access to weapons is crucial to sustaining that cycle of violence. So it raises, I think, important policy questions about how you manage issues of urban security going forward. An important footnote to all of this in Africa is if you look at the urbanization figures for Africa, they are phenomenal. People are moving into cities like Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, Lagos, etc., etc. So the challenges will increase. And critical to that, I think, is to keep weapons away from these areas, an ability to deal with drug markets more intelligently, so to, of course, target key dealers, key crime bosses, and not just drug users or low-level dealers, which is the standard approach, filling prisons, but really just blocking up criminal justice systems and not doing anything really to respond to the issue, and working on public services. This competition between state agencies as the provision of legitimate services against the provision of criminal services. And on the Cape Flats, but not only there, the degree to which crime bosses pay school fees, help people with money when they need food. And the pandemic has really provided huge openings for that, where criminal resources have bought legitimacy.
That's right. Of course, classic phenomenon that the crime gangs replace the state and the services of the state. And you mentioned the pandemic, and it's that I want to end up with, because along with writing this book, you've also just written a book with one of your colleagues, Tuesday Rotano, about the impact of the pandemic on transnational or organized crime. I mean, for writers like me, the output is just extraordinary. I'm extremely jealous, let me say that first of all. But let's have a look at the pandemic and where the pandemic will interact with issues like the ones that you've raised in Give Us More Guns. It sounds to me from what you're saying as though we need to be bracing ourselves for a magnification and acceleration of a lot of these issues of urban violence associated with state collapse or partial collapse and organized crime.
Yes, I think that's true. It of course depends where in different places. And I say often in the South African context that we, at least for South African cities, we should be looking to what has occurred in Brazil, for example, rather than necessarily elsewhere. And I think what the pandemic did, I mean, as you know from the other book, and I'm not as prolific as you think because the guns book took a long time to write. So then we began on the COVID book as that was drawing to a close. The sense, at least, that we had that drug trafficking had stopped, and we weren't the only analysts thinking that. In the early days of the pandemic, there was a sense, drug prices were going up in certain places. It proved to be completely false, frankly, and that the illicit economy continued quite dramatically in the course of the pandemic. Interestingly enough, and yes, there were some disruptions, but it didn't fundamentally slow. And then key individuals and groups in the criminal economy saw opportunity, and they saw it quite fast in the sense that, and in the Cape Flats, to bring it back to the Give Us More Guns, people were desperate for food, for resources, etc. And we ourselves, as the Global Initiative, thought that, as we run the Resilience Fund, and one of the things that we thought we could do is, instead of funding gang interveners, some of that work shifted into running soup kitchens. And some of that was simply about bringing a balance in this legitimacy equation, the sense that not only criminal actors should support communities, but also civil society and state. So I think what the pandemic has left in its wake is a kind of a number of paradoxes, the sense that states are important, states set regulations, etc., etc. But at the same time, where states are relatively weak or constrained, there were real openings for criminal actors. And that occurred around the world. There will be a lag with that, with actors who have moved into those spaces and will be hard to eradicate. And a lot of this, as you yourself have said, is about governance, about re-establishing governance, about pushing forward the frontiers of governance in complex urban spaces. And that's hugely challenging in my view. And so this issue of urban security, I want to argue, I think is absolutely key to our thinking around organized crime going forward. Looking at, yes, these big illicit markets, the increase in drug production, but then to look at its impact in very, very local areas where for ordinary people it's violent, it's constraining, it blocks services, it disrupts schooling. And these are two sides of the same coin, and they're not often seen as that. The global dimensions of very localized problems in the discussion are often two separate kind of policy discussions. And I think we need to bridge that divide ourselves.
I'd just like to finish off by highlighting one or two things. Often this seems like a very exotic issue for many people, particularly in the West. But actually, things are shifting to some extent. I've been looking, for example, at what goes on in southern Holland, of course, one of the most affluent countries in the world. But they have developed their own drugs production units down there, illicit drugs. And this is actually leading to some similar problems of violence, of police corruption and intimidation that we've seen elsewhere in the world. So it's not like we're all inoculated from this if we happen to live in affluent areas, as anyone from Los Angeles will be able to tell you as well.
No, totally true. It may look different in different places, but the phenomena is essentially the same. Criminal economies growing, often very violent. And that violence, of course, occurs in places where there's contestation between criminal groups. Just because there isn't violence in some places doesn't mean that criminal groups are not in play. They just have a more dominant hold over the market. And the solutions, Misha, as you know, are not very easy. There isn't a silver bullet to this. Yes, what is required is a real rethink on drug policy. The sense that this is key, that this is, and I'm, of course, many people are saying that. But the discussion on drug policy internationally is still pretty fractured, I have to say, although it is moving. A discussion on urban management, a discussion on how this is a shared responsibility amongst all of us, a discussion just on the degree to which globalization has brought, yes, development, but enormous challenges of illicit markets, which we are not very well placed to respond to. And we're sort of using the tools of the 1970s and 1980s, quite frankly, to a policy challenge which is not well geared. Our policy responses are just not well geared, not sophisticated, not strategic. And as you know, that's the objective of the global initiative. But the sense that there needs to be a rethink about how we respond to some of these issues, and a proactive rethink. And to the Give Us More Guns conclusion is, if you want to reduce homicides in South Africa and reduce the criminal market, focus on guns. And the state itself has been a key source of illegal guns. So there are real policy tools that we have, because it's a state responsible. It's a state that can in turn respond. So the position is not hopeless, but it does mean a much higher level of political will and sophistication in our response, I would argue.
Well, Mark, one thing I know is that the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime will be at the centre of that policy debate. And the work that the Global Initiative has been doing really is incredibly important. And for me as a journalist working on this, it's an extraordinary resource as well. So anyway, if you want to know more about this, all I can suggest is you run out and buy a copy of Give Us More Guns. It really is a great read. Mark, thanks very much for the book, for the work you do, and for this interview. Thank you.
Thank you, Misha. Thank you very much.